This video was sponsored by Keeps. I gotta keep working on the boat. Let's review where we left off last time. I got in the river, realized I needed a boat, so I got some plywood. I hooked said plywood together. I cut the longer piece of plywood down into shapes that looked like a boat. I made some ribs. I hooked the ribs into the plywood, and I was left with this. A shape that somewhat resembles a boat with no bottom and a whole bunch of exposed screws and nasty edges. So let's jump right in. Now, I thought I'd start off this video with showing you just how much of an idiot I am, because the first minute or so of this video is showing a terrible, horrible mistake. Now, the next step in the boat building process was to make chines. Chines are these long strips that run in between each rib. Now, I didn't have long enough pieces, so I had to make some. And being the moron I am, I thought I could just cut a small bevel on two pieces and glue them together with some epoxy. Like this. But, as I said, I'm a moron. But I didn't know that yet, so we'll just pretend like I know what I'm doing at this point. I glued them together with epoxy, took off my clamps, ran them through my planer, and I cut them to the appropriate shape that my chine needed to be. Don't mind that bulldozer, I was getting my driveway paved as I filmed this. At this point, stupid, naive Jason started trying to insert his chines into the chine notches in between each rib. And this is when I quickly realized that my method of gluing them together was, well, horrible. Did you see that? Did you see it just snap right there? Watch, I'll show you again. Plop. Just fell apart. You want to see it one more time? Here, I'll do it one more time. Snap! What an idiot. So I did what any woodworker would do at this point. I screamed at myself for a good few seconds, and then I decided there's got to be a way to do this. Correction, there's got to be a right way to do this. So I got on the good old internet and I looked up how to join pieces of wood together for boating applications. And I learned about a little something called the scarf joint. Now, a scarf joint is just a miter joint glued together, but the difference between a scarf joint and my stupid miter joint is that a scarf joint is extremely elongated, which gives you a much longer glue surface. So naturally, in order to cut this elongated scarf joint, I had to create a jig to cut a very elongated bevel miter thing on my boards. So after gluing two scrap pieces of plywood together, I squared it all out, first on the joiner and then the table saw, and then I had to cut basically a very long wedge that I could use as a template to cut my long scarf joint. So I took a piece of ply and I screwed it to my block of glued up plywood, and then using that as a reference, I was able to run this block through the table saw and cut a nice long wedge out of two pieces of 3/4 inch ply. Then I removed my little reference guide sheet thing and I drilled some holes into this scrap piece of ply. I know that seems weird, but it'll all make sense in just a second. I feel like I tell you guys that a lot. Maybe I should explain things better as I go. Anyways, I cleaned up my drilled holes with the chisel, and this allowed me to now clamp my stock piece of wood that I'd be using for my chines onto this handy dandy scarfing jig, and then run it through the table saw. Now the stock piece of wood will mimic the shape of my plywood template, and as you can see, it cuts a nice long, smooth bevel onto that stock piece. This gives me about, 10 times the glue surface that I was trying to work with before. And not only that, it's no longer end grain to end grain, so it's a much stronger joint. My second big mistake was how I was actually gluing it up. Now, being naive, dumb Jason, I thought just epoxy was fine, but it's not. So on my second attempt, after talking to some friends and doing some research, I did what's called wetting in the joint with regular epoxy, and then I made up some thickened epoxy using this crazy snow-like substance called colloidal silica. Colon silica. I don't know how to pronounce it, but basically it's like powdered glass that you add to the epoxy and make it nice and thick, and in doing so it actually makes the epoxy much, much stronger. So after mixing up a bunch until it was peanut butter consistency, I spread that on top of my already wettened joint with the regular epoxy, and I was finally ready to glue my scarves together. In order to make sure that my joint didn't slip at all, I stuck them together, and then very carefully I applied a few push pins at the end of my joint just to keep it from slipping. No, this was not an original idea. It's something I learned in my stupid Jason research. That's what I like to call my research when I have to figure out how to do things the right way after I did them the wrong way. Anyways, after sticking the push pins in so my joint wouldn't slide, I also applied some clamps on either side of the joint, and this would keep it from moving the other direction. Just holding everything nice and secure. And then once I had those clamps applied, I just applied a zillion clamps to hold my joint firmly while it dried. And then I set it aside and I waited. Once my glue was dry, I took a block plane and I cleaned up the edges just to remove any excess epoxy. Yes, this probably was not good for my block plane blade, but I was willing to sacrifice it for the cause. With my joint all cleaned up and glued properly this time, I once again planed my material down to smooth up those joints and get it to the appropriate thickness. Then what seemed like the plot from Groundhog Day, I did everything I did before, but this time with properly glued wood. Pieces were so long I had to open up my shop door so that I could run them through the table saw. And then another thing I learned in my research is that before just shoving them in those chine notches, it's a good idea to clamp the pieces on the outside of the boat just to make sure that they're all going to bend the way they should bend and not snap. So after securely clamping the chines to the outside of the boat, I double checked my scarf joint to make sure that it looked okay, and it looked fantastic. I may be an idiot, but I'm a teachable idiot. So now we're back to where the video started, but hopefully there will be no more mistakes from this point on. Knowing me, there probably will be. After confidently clamping my chine to the outside of the boat, I was ready to insert it into my chine notches. So first I had to cut a compound angle on one end that would perfectly meet up with the bow stem. Then I had to mark out a drill pattern on the outside of the boat so that I would know exactly where to place all 5 zillion of the screws that would hold the chine in place. And with that, I was ready to insert the chine. Man, I really love using all these boat terms. It just makes me feel so cool. Anyways, the chine insertion process, it can be a little tricky and fumbly, but with a little hitting there and banging here, I was able to get my chine inserted. Now, what the plans say to do is just to start at the bow and then slowly work your way to the back, inserting the chine into the notches as you go. So I got it all clamped securely on the front. I pre-drilled with a countersink bit, and then I just started throwing screws in there. I also clamped a clamp directly onto the chine that I could use just to leverage the chine into the right angle as I screwed and drilled it into place. And it worked great. Here's where I made my second big mistake. I know I said I hoped there wouldn't be any more, but alas, I am only human, and I've never built a boat before. The plans say that when you get to the transom, you need to transfer the angle of the transom onto the chine so that you can cut it to that angle and slip it in so that it is perfectly flush and tight against the transom. But being an idiot, like I've said before, I did not account for the compoundness of the angle. So after transferring the mark from my transom, I inserted my chine only to find out that I cut it a good ½ inch short of the transom.
Boo!
Gosh, that hurts. But my chine was fully installed at this point and there wasn't a whole lot I could do about it. So I decided to put that mistake behind me, move on to my second chine, and like most things in my life, I'll just worry about that later. So I installed the check-in sign. Nope, that's not right. I installed the second chine the exact same way I installed the first, starting at the bow and just working my way back towards that bloody transom that I knew was waiting with a previous mistake. So here's where I did something either really smart or really dumb. I figured since I cut the other chine improperly, I might as well do the same thing to this one so at least they'd match. I mean, if you're gonna make a mistake, you might as well just go with it and make people think that you didn't make a mistake. At least that was my plan here. So I cut the other chine a ½ inch short so that it would match on both sides. And I was starting to compile a solution for this problem. I just really didn't want to have to deal with it. I decided that instead of just trying to shove a little block in there that would probably be noticeable and obvious that I made a mistake, I would do the opposite and shove a giant block in there. But I kind of made it decorative. I rounded it over on one side to dive into the back of the transom and made sure the angles were cut perfectly to fit the side and back of the boat. And to tell you the truth, if you didn't know it wasn't supposed to be there, you'd probably never even be able to tell that I messed up. At least that's what I keep telling myself. But anyways, with my oopsie blocks installed, it was time to move on to the bottom.
This video is sponsored by Keeps. Did you know that 2 out of 3 men will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? The clock's ticking, people. But the best thing to do is to start preventing it before it's actually a problem. And that's where Keeps comes in. Keeps offers generic versions of the only 2 FDA-approved hair loss treatments. Now, some of you guys might have tried some of the other treatments before, but I guarantee you haven't tried them at these prices. They're crazy. It doesn't have to be super expensive to keep your hair nowadays. Keeps has revolutionized the way that men are treated for hair loss. They make it crazy simple. It's delivered to your door every 3 months, so you don't have to go to the doctor or a pharmacist. You just get online, one of their doctors takes care of you, and boom, just shows up at your door. Magic. Results can take 4 to 6 months, so you don't want to delay. If you're ready to take action to prevent hair loss, go to keeps.com/bourbonmoth or click the link in my video description and get 50% off your first order. Go. Do it.
With our chines all installed, it was time to start prepping the boat to place the bottom on it. The bottom, not my bottom. This involved doing a lot of hand planing around the chine and plywood surface. I had to bring down that plywood so that it evenly matched the chine. So after hand planing, I sanded and sanded some more. Then finally, I took a straight edge and I laid it across each of the ribs just to make sure that it was perfectly flush from left to right. And with a little adjustment, my bottom was ready to be set on that boat. Now this was a bit awkward. This is a 14-foot ½ inch sheet of ply, and struggling to get it on that boat was not the most enjoyable task, but in the end I got it in place. Now it says in the plans you need 2 to 3 other people. 2 to 3 other people. I'm so sick of it saying that. I'm all by myself, plans. Jeez. But who needs 2 to 3 other people when you have some ratchet straps and a drill? So I used a ratchet strap to pull down the front of the boat, and I did the exact same thing to pull down the back of the boat. It actually worked really well. I mean, I think I'm gonna rewrite these plans that say, here's how you build a boat all on your lonesome, because, well, I'm all alone. Really, alone. With my bottom ratchet strapped into place, that's funny, I traced out the shape of the boat onto the sheet of plywood. Then I removed all my ratchet straps, took the bottom back off the boat, and just using a jigsaw, I cut out the rough shape of my boat bottom. I wasn't being too careful at this point because there will be a slight overhang on the bottom that we'll clean up later. Before placing the bottom onto the boat, I went around with some 3M 5200 sealant epoxy compound gunk, and I applied it to every single surface that the bottom would come in contact with. This will act both as a glue and a sealant to keep water from passing in or out of the boat. And remember when I was glorifying myself, saying how you could do all this by yourself? Yeah, I decided it wasn't a great idea to put the bottom on by myself. After applying all that glue, the last thing I wanted was to smear it all over the place trying to get the bottom on. So I called up my neighbor Brad. He's a great friend. He'll not even ask questions when you call him up in the middle of the night and ask him to come help you with your bottom. He was very relieved to realize it was the boat bottom though. Next, I had to figure out a way to find my chines underneath my bottom. So I made this fancy little jig here. Now, it might look a little funny, but it works great. Basically, you can run the jig along the side of the boat, and the point on the top tells you exactly where the middle of the chine is. So using my homemade little jig, I transferred a line onto the bottom of the boat, and this gave me the appropriate place to add all of my screws. Next, using a ruler, I spaced out a predetermined drill pattern, and I pre-drilled all of my screw holes, followed up by adding what seemed like 1,000,000 screws to the bottom of the boat. It seems a little ironic to put a bottom on a boat and then drill a bunch of holes in it, but the plans said to do it, so I'll blame them if anything goes wrong. So while Brad firmly held my bottom, I sunk in all the screws. Lost my train of thought. Then we had to mark out where all the ribs landed so we could add screws to those, making sure not to put any screws in my pre-drilled drain holes. That wouldn't be good. So with everything marked, I again drilled 500 holes in the bottom of my boat. Man, I hope this doesn't come back to bite me. But, well, you only live once. With my bottom securely fastened, I cleaned up the entire edge, first with the sander, then with the block plane, and then I sanded it just a little bit more until the entire bottom was nice and flush with the side walls of the boat. Now, you would think, based on my previous mistakes, that I'm crazy for this next part, but here's where I decided to go rogue and ignore the plans. Now, the plans wanted you to leave the bow of the boat just like this. Exposed screws, exposed plywood, and I don't know if it's my furniture background, but I just couldn't bring myself to leave any exposed screws on the outside of this boat. So I decided to make a little nose cap to go over the front of the boat and hide up all of my screws. Now, I thought about how to do this for a while and finally determined that I was going to make it out of 3 separate pieces. Problem was, these are 3 pieces, all cut at different angles, and clamping them together was going to be a nightmare. I mean, look at me. I can barely even hold them together the right way, let alone clamp them. So I scratched my head, I thought, I pondered, I ate some food, and then I came back and thought some more. And that's when I had an idea. I thought I figured out a way to do this. Hopefully this will work. So the first thing I did was tape a piece of wax paper to the front of the boat. I know, just go with me on this. And then I took my centerpiece and I perfectly aligned it onto the bow, and then using a 23 gauge nailer, I just nailed it to the front of the boat. I promise I have a plan. Seriously, I think this will work. Just believe me here. My thought process was that by tacking it with a 23 gauge nailer, that would hold it secure while I clamped my other pieces on, and then I could just pull the whole thing off after the glue dries. But I still had the issue of not having anything to hook my clamps to on those outer two pieces. So I cut a few clamping cauls with an angle on them that was basically the opposite of the angle I was clamping. And I glued each caul firmly in place onto my outer pieces with some CA glue and some accelerator spray. I had purposely made my outer pieces thicker than they needed to be so that I wouldn't have to worry about my clamping cauls marring up that outer surface. So after gluing those clamping cauls in place, I decided to test and see if I could get a nice secure clamp onto that middle piece. And wouldn't you know it, every once in a while I do something that actually works. So learning from my past gluing mistake, I decided to not just glue this together with epoxy. I was going to go the same route that I used for my scarf joints, and so I wet in the entire edge with some thinned epoxy and then added some more of that coal and glass stuff to thicken the epoxy, and applied the thickened epoxy over the already wet in surface of my middle piece. Then all I had to do was apply my two outer pieces, hook some clamps in place, and, well, just let it sit and do its thing. As you can see, if you look really close, you can kind of determine the shape I'm going for on the inside there. So after letting it sit for a good 24 hours, I removed my clamps and prayed like crazy that this thing would easily pop off. And just like that, it came right off. I pulled out those 23 gauge nails and I was ready to start shaping my made up nose cone thing into the end result. So using the table saw, I just trimmed off those clamping cauls rather than try and break them off, and I was left with a nice smooth surface. Then I took it over to the drum sander and removed the majority of the excess material on the front with the drum sander to bring it down to its almost final shape, like this. And then finally I cleaned up the entire thing just with the hand sander until it was nice and smooth, and I was really thinking this is gonna work, just like this. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't avoid putting any screws in the front of the ship, but I decided if I was going to insert screws, I was going to do it in a way that I could easily plug them and make them almost disappear. So after prepping the piece for plugs, I applied an insane amount of 3M 5200 to the back of my little nose piece, and I stuck it on there. Then after clamping it to hold it securely, I inserted a few screws. And that's all I have to say about that. As far as I could tell, my nose cap piece was a huge success, and so with that, it was time to move to the back of the boat and start trimming out my transom. My transom was simply trimmed out with 3 pieces of ash, cut to mimic the bottom and sides of the boat, held in place with a few screws that I also prepped for plugging later, and some more 3M 5200. I wiped each piece down in between application with some acetone to remove the excess sealant, and then using a flush cut saw, I trimmed off all the extra little bits to make it look nice and pretty. We like pretty. For now, I'm just applying the trim to the back of the boat, but don't you worry your little face. I will eventually apply a second piece of trim to the side to cover up those ugly screws you can see. With my transom all trimmed out, it was time to cut and install my chine battens. Now the chine battens are simply a piece of trim that will cover up the millions of screws I use to install the chine through the outside of the boat. So after applying more 5200 to the outside of the boat, I again called my good friend Brad. I'm getting kind of used to having help. Man, a guy could get spoiled with neighbors like that. And after applying more 5200 to the chine itself, Brad held one end while I positioned the chine batten into place. Now I designed that front nose piece so that the chine batten sat just behind that front piece. I thought it gave it a nice profile and look, and I'll trim down that whole top portion when I'm done. Did you hear me? I screwed my chine battens in place working to the back transom, and then I flush cut those even with the transom itself. And then after doing one side, I hopped over and did the exact same thing to, well, the other side. And then, you guys are gonna think this is so crazy, I added a bunch more screws. Because that's basically all building a boat is just installing a crazy amount of screws. With my second batten screwed on and trimmed flush with the transom, I wiped down all my seams with an acetone soaked rag to remove any excess 5200. And then, remember when I said I just hated exposed screws? Well, this is where that comes back to bite me. Not in the way that I made a mistake, it's just I forced myself to make about 300 ash plugs to hide all of my screw holes. So after making a zillion plugs, I used epoxy inside each pre-drilled hole, and then I added my plugs. I gotta tell you, this was probably the most satisfying step on the boat so far. I mean, sure, it was fun to see it take shape and look like a boat and blah 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 blah, but I just love covering up ugly screws. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I like it. Except when this happens. That I do not like so much. No. While I waited for the epoxy on all my plugs to dry, I just couldn't help myself. I had to trim this nose cap flush so that it didn't look so bulky and awkward. So, well, it's my boat. I can do what I want, so I did it. Then the only thing I like more than covering up ugly screws is flush cutting plugs. I mean, how could you not like this part? And fortunately for me, I had a crazy amount of plugs to flush cut. But I loved every minute of it. Then after flush cutting them all, I even enjoyed sanding them smooth. One of the few times I really enjoy sanding, because man, doesn't that clean up nice. So after sanding all of my cut plugs to just make it pretty, I finally got to do something that I have yet to do on this build so far. And that was to flip the boat over to its right up direction. Is that how you say that? Its upright direction. And finally get my first look at what this boat is properly gonna look like. I mean, kind of look like. I still got a lot of flipping work to do, but you can actually tell it's a boat now, which is cool. Next, I will have to work on my handrails, exterior paint, internal seats, and all that fun stuff. But we're out of time for this video, so you'll have to stay tuned for the next.
Well, hot dang. I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you've enjoyed watching this process kind of come to life. As you can tell, I still have quite a long ways to go. So stay tuned. In the next couple weeks, I'll do another video and I'll show you how far I've gotten. In the meantime, you can check out some of these other videos around here. And if you're not doing it already, go follow me on Instagram, Facebook, check out my website for plans and cool merchandise, all that jazz. There's links down below. in the video description. Okay, gotta get back to my boat.